Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Today, we're going to get an update on Ukraine, but before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
All right, folks, we've got a little bit of a change happening today at Headlines in History, and hope you bear with us here. This is our first attempt at this, bringing on a new co-host. So today's episode may seem a little different, but I'm excited to welcome on board to Headlines in History a friend of mine that I met last June in Montenegro, as one does, and he's now a non-resident fellow with us here at ISD, and by way of Canada originally, and then now in Cambridge, but will also be soon moving to Hong Kong. Tristen Naylor. Tristen, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm delighted to join you on this, and no doubt it will be different, but hopefully different in a good way.
Yes, exactly. And I assume you are countering our tariffs today by charging us 25% more for joining this podcast.
This has become 25% more expensive for you. I presume you're not going to pass that on to the listeners who you know.
Well, wait a second. That's how tariffs work. I don't understand. But
I mean, you clearly don't understand how tariffs work.
Clearly,
I trust that the American president, however, certainly does.
Of course. So yeah, folks. So Tristen is going to join us for the foreseeable future on Headlines in History, and he's going to be analyzing these foreign policy issues with me on a every other week when we do this. And Tristen, tell us a little bit about yourself so folks know who they're listening to.
Well, I am based here in Cambridge, UK, the original Cambridge.
Yeah, I should have said Cambridge too. We're not talking Boston here.
No, though Boston is lovely.
Yes.
But I'm based here in Cambridge. I'm the director of what's called the Oxbridge Diplomatic Academy, which is a center of excellence for diplomatic studies, jointly based in both Oxford and Cambridge. But before I took up this post, I was the assistant professor of international politics and history at the University of Cambridge. And then before that, I had posts as the lecturer in diplomacy at Oxford. I had a post as a fellow in international relations at the London School of Economics. And I've also held posts at NYU and at Sciences Po.
All right. Well, you're going to have lots to talk about. And I'm looking forward to seeing where this takes us in this new format. So hopefully the listeners will enjoy it as well. But all right. So one thing I got to do before we kick off is I have to give a shout out to one of our newest listeners, Dr. Denise Hoffman. Listened to her first episode last week and thoroughly enjoyed it. But more interestingly, her 8-year-old son, Andrew, also really got into it and is now diving into myth making and how authoritarian regimes use that to stay in power. So shout out to Denise and Andrew. Andrew is also on the Vienna Little League baseball team that I coach. So bigger shout out to the McFarland Nationals. We've got our 2A draft tomorrow night, which should be exciting. And I got to tell you, be prepared if any of you ever coach Little League baseball, because it is serious business. And I was not fully prepared for that. But anyways, all right, enough of that. Let's get into the news. Today, we are going to give an update on the German elections. Most of you regular listeners will remember we did a mini deep dive on that a couple weeks ago. So we'll update you on that. And then in the same vein, we're going to update you into what's going on in Syria with their transitional government. And then we're going to top it off with an analysis of the recent G20 meeting before finally turning to our mini deep dive, which will be a conversation with Edward Fishman about Ukraine and Russia and the U.S. I think it's been a fairly slow news week with Ukraine and the U.S. So I don't know if he's really going to have anything to talk about. But anyways, I want to kick it off. So just to move to the German elections, the results from last week's German election are out now. Friedrich Merz of the center-right Christian Democrats is likely to be Germany's next chancellor after their party won the most amount of seats in the elections. Something that we pretty much knew was going to happen. If you remember the mini deep dive we did a couple weeks ago, this election took place a few months after the country's governing coalition collapsed late last year. And that was due to a lot of worsening economic issues in Germany and disputes over Germany's migration regime, which is an issue for a lot of countries these days. Despite the CDU, the Christian Democrats, winning the election, this was their second worst result ever. And the Social Democrats, who led the outgoing government, if you guys remember, Chancellor Olaf Scholz was the chancellor. The Social Democrats had their worst showing since their foundation in the 19th century, winning just 16% of the vote. The biggest storyline of the election, of course, though, is the second place finish of the far right Alternative for Germany, which, under their party's leader, Alice Weidel, got almost 21% of the vote. So we've had about a week for this to kind of sink in and see what's happening in Germany. Tristen, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, it's kind of nothing super shocking on the results, but still shocking that the AfD did as well as they did.
You're absolutely right. This is more or less what we thought the outcome was going to be, but certainly the story of this election is the nearly 21% of the vote that the AfD managed to secure. And this is what we've been watching over the past couple of years in Germany and what we should keep our eye on. But that said, one of the things that I think is really worth keeping in mind is that while the AfD's share of the vote certainly reveals some very deep fractures in German society and some fundamental shifts in how politics is working in Germany, with parties on the fringes doing much better than expected, I do think it's worth keeping in mind that the AfD was polling at around 20% for the months leading up to the election. And so the actual election itself didn't change their support levels. And what's noteworthy here is that there was a lot of talk that as Elon Musk inserted himself into the race, also the American Vice President, J.D. Vance, there was a lot of worry, or maybe concern as a slightly more neutral term, that this would really ramp up support for the AfD. And in fact, it didn't. If anything, it seems that Musk's intervention in the election, Musk's outright support for the AfD actually may have even backfired and rallied the parties more to the center and to the left. So in a way that is kind of unexpected. It's counterintuitive to what the narratives around sort of the role of Musk or X, Twitter, in electoral politics is. And I think this is something that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, like you said, I don't think this is going away anytime soon. I mean, he seems to be, trying to play a role in multiple different political issues around the globe. And so, one thing I also wanted to ask you is, on that point, do you think there was also an effect on the Trump administration's approach to Europe and the Ukraine Russia issue right now that was sort of a pushback against those far right parties or right parties that might have been leaning more towards the Trump Vance administration? Like, because we've seen that in Canada in the last few months, or as the last 6 weeks, as the Trump administration has been, outright kind of going after Canada. I've seen polls that it's actually benefited the Liberal Party in Canada more so than the Conservative. So did you think there's a bit of that at play as well?
Oh, certainly. And I mean, you point to the Canadian example, and it's extraordinary. It just 2 months ago, it was a foregone conclusion that
Right.
the governing Liberal Party was finished. I mean, to the point that just before Christmas, Justin Trudeau, the current Canadian Prime Minister, announced that he'd be stepping aside. And it did seem that whoever would be chosen as his successor would very quickly become the leader of the opposition to the conservative to a conservative government led by a man named Pierre Poilievre. But exactly as you say, over the past 6 weeks, what we have seen is extraordinary, and we've actually seen this backlash against right of center parties that are taking pages from the Trump MAGA playbook. And I mean, in the case of Canada, it is completely reversed the fortunes of both the governing Liberals and the opposition Conservatives. And exactly, or near exactly as we saw in Germany, it actually excited the left of center's power base. So, to point to another unexpected result from the German elections, let's look at the far left party, Die Linke. Just 2 months ago, the party was polling at only 3%, and yet they secured nearly 9% of the vote, which equates to 64 seats in the Bundestag. And much of the credit for this has gone to the party leader, to Heidi Reichnick, for drumming up support from young voters who feel alienated by centrist parties and who are very much worried about the surge in the far right vote and the anti-immigrant sentiment that has really, really taken hold, not just in Germany, but a sentiment that we see taking hold throughout the West.
So, one thing about this form of government in Germany is that now Merz has to form a coalition government because obviously they don't have a majority in the seats they won. And he's going to have to get some parties to go along with him to do that. And as some of the listeners might know, there's a longstanding history in German politics of not including the far right parties, regardless of what they even though AfD got 21%, Merz isn't going to be going to the AfD to say, "Hey, join me in creating a coalition government." So, there's yes, Merz won, but the tricky part is now forming a government. Do you think, with the increase in numbers in some of these other parties that you mentioned, do you think there's going to be an easier path to that, or is it still going to be tricky moving forward?
I think it's going to be really difficult. The nature of the results are such that there's not a lot of wiggle room in terms of how you put together this coalition, particularly if he will abide by the long-held convention that those in the far right will not form any part of the coalition uh, government. And look, the AfD did very, very well. 20% of the vote. This is the most successful German far right party since the Nazis. And, that's just a cold, hard fact, and indeed a frightening one. And what is, Merz is in a really difficult position. I do suspect, will be able to cobble together a coalition that will function. But, maybe the thing that we really need to pay attention to is then how this coalition changes its policies or how it approaches particularly fractious issues like immigration, like even the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, and that was the one thing I was going to mention too, and the tricky the debt break is a huge issue in German politics, and like what they can, for listeners, that's they have a limit on what they can spend versus their debt and everything. So there's a need for them to maybe go past that, which is going to be a rancorous discussion in German politics. So yeah, I assume we'll be talking a lot about German politics in the coming months, and especially oh yeah, there's also this issue, like you said, about Russia, Ukraine, the U.S., what they are or aren't doing on the continent, and what that means for Germany and France and others to increase defense spending. We're going to need Germany if there's going to be any sort of European push for a peace deal or something that they come up with. You're going to need Germany involved. So yeah, a lot to happen here moving forward.
The big thing that happened here on Sunday in Europe was the London Security Summit, where we saw the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, and the French President, Emmanuel Macron, take the lead in beginning to form what they're calling, this iteration of the coalition of the willing. But one of the notable absences from the discussion was the German Chancellor. He was present, but Germany presently is offline while it
Right.
sort of figures out itself. But as soon as Merz has formed his government, it is absolutely necessary that Germany stands shoulder to shoulder with France and the UK in leading this new coalition of the willing to place Ukraine, or ideally place Ukraine, in a position of strength so that it may engage in ceasefire and eventual peace negotiations with Russia. Moving over to Syria, I think it's worth looking at the internal challenges that the Syrian transitional government now faces. Of course, Syria's interim leader, Ahmed al-Shara, launched a national dialogue conference in Damascus last week to draft a new constitution, no small task. And at the conclusion of the conference, there were actually few concrete details about how al-Shara intends to structure Syria's new government. The conference had 600 attendees across all political factions and civil society groups within the country. The speakers at the conference emphasized freedom of expression and peaceful coexistence, and the rejection of sectarian or ethnic quotas in public positions. And besides building the structure of a new constitution, the talks did mainly focus on institution building, on transitional justice, and on economic recovery. Sort of the things that we hope that it would. Now, this interim government was meant to last just 3 months until the 1st of March, but of course we are now over that date. And the idea having been that a permanent government would take shape after that, but we're not there yet. And of course, at the same time, there is the external dimension, and Israel has recently stepped up strikes into Syria. So, Syria as a country, al-Shara as its interim leader, faces a lot right now. Kelly, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I've got a few. You mentioned the external issue as well, but we're going to start with the internal at the moment. And I think, overall, I've got some good news, some bad news. I think as far as when I step back and sort of analyze this, but the good news is that they're holding a national dialogue in a country like Syria that has so many differing groups that have been trying to get some sort of government recognition for years and years. And remember, this is a country that's coming out of decades of Alawite rule under the Assad regime, and a lot of the other ethnic groups or minority groups or majority groups even, didn't get a lot of say in what was going on politically. The patronage system was all tied to the Alawites and the cronies of the Assad regime. So, just trying to move beyond that is a key first step in trying to create a functioning, legitimate government that actually works for the betterment of Syrian people. So this is a good thing that they're doing this. I will say, when I think of national dialogues, it harkens me back to my days as an intel analyst when I was covering Yemen, and Yemen had a national dialogue. It was longer than a week. It was almost a year long, and from 2013 into 2014. And it did a lot of really good things. And it got a lot of people's voices, as you mentioned, with the Syria national dialogue as well, got a lot of these voices out there to push for what they've been wanting from a governmental standpoint, a governance standpoint. And so that's an important step. Now, what really matters at the end of the day is the buy-in from al-Shara and his government. Is he going to listen to this? Are they going to implement some of these recommendations and the things that really create a more equitable society from a governance standpoint and structure? That didn't happen in Yemen, and the Houthis felt that they were once again being left out. And it's important to remember that they didn't. No analogy is the same, obviously, but in Yemen, there was still an entrenched power structure. The president had stepped down, but there was still an entrenched power structure that didn't necessarily want to change the patronage system and things the way they had been for decades. And the Houthis got left out once again, which we all know the story then of the Houthis then started marching south to Sana'a, led to its civil war. Yemen is still a mess. So it all depends on the buy-in, I think, of the Al Shara government, and whether or not they're willing to listen to this. You are starting, I think, from a little bit better of a spot, though, because you're not trying to work with the Assad regime to do this national dialogue, which would have been just a show thing, because they weren't really going to, let off any of the levers of power or anything and give those to anybody else. So it remains to be seen. I think it's a good start, but there's a long way to go here. And I don't think we should, harp too much on, the 3-month window and of the transitional government and things like that either, because these things, you'd rather have it done right in the long term than have them rush through something that's not going to work. So, we'll keep an eye on that going forward. But there's also, as you mentioned, a whole host of external issues. The internal is enough to drop any government to its knees and trying to figure this out. But externally, you've got Israel taking back land in the Golan Heights. You've got them attacking into southern Damascus, all the way close to Damascus, calling for sort of a buffer area in the south of Syria. So you're dealing with that. You still have massive sanctions in place from the international community on the government that was, because it was the Assad regime before, but now even HTS, the group that Al-Shara leads, was a terrorist organization. So there's sanctions on them. And so there's going to be a lot of work to rebuild Syria that needs to go hand in hand with this as well. So just there's a lot of things that are potentially standing in the way of making things right in Syria.
The challenges are multifaceted and supremely complex. Uh, in terms of security, what is the primary one that you think that Al Shara has to focus on in order to stabilize the situation as best as possible? Is it Israel? Is it elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it's multiple. I mean, you mentioned Israel, obviously, but then there's still, this harkens back to the national dialogue and inclusion as well, because there's still, bringing everyone within Syria to the table. So there's other groups and militias and former rebel groups that are still out there that aren't necessarily under the umbrella yet. So, there's internal security issues of other Syrians, but then there's also the security issue with Israel. What role is Erdogan and Turkey going to play in this? Because they've had a lot of backing of HTS and Al Shara up to this point, but how much is that going to continue now that Al Shara has power in Syria? That's a big question mark that's out there. And what role will they be as a potential stabilizer or destabilizer? So there's a lot of different things going on, and like you said, it's an extremely convoluted situation and a lot of moving parts, and it's going to be difficult, right? I mean, this was basically a failed state that Assad had minimal control over a small section that he's now lost, and you've got these groups are now trying to figure out how to move forward. But at the end of the day, the more people Al Shara can bring in, and the more buy-in he can get from others, the better this will be.
And I would imagine that sanctions relief or sanctions unwinding will be a big part of
Definitely.
bringing others in, not just, obviously domestically, but bringing in much needed finance, particularly from the US and the EU. I know that talk has begun in Brussels about removing some of the sanctions on Syria. But what is it that Al Shara will need to do to begin to have sanctions lifted? And conversely, what do capitals around the world need to do in order to begin to walk these things back? And I was just talking to a former student of mine, Stephen Fallon, who is an expert in sanctions, and he was describing just how uh, complex and how difficult it is to actually walk things back. So, what is it that Al Shara needs to do right now to begin that process, to give the US, to give the EU the assurances that they need?
Yeah, and that's spot on. I mean, it's in many ways the easy part is putting sanctions on or designating someone a terrorist or a terrorist group. Walking that back is extremely difficult, and it's also difficult because it can be a political liability, right? I think a lot of this is going to be determined by Al Shara's actions and how he goes forward governing, how he tries to bring in other groups and just doesn't become another Assad in different clothes. I think that's going to be what European governments, American government, and others are going to be watching is how inclusive is he? Is he, he seems to have been doing a lot of the correct steps so far, and what he's done about moving away from HTS. He's literally been putting on a suit and doing things like that to seem more open and sort of the type of government and leader that the West and other countries could work with. But there's also been, some other reporting that we're getting out of some of the other cities and towns that HTS had controlled before going to Damascus that aren't necessarily as optimistic on the way they're governing. But he needs to keep moving forward on those things, bringing in others, and then giving these governments and these politicians an opening to be able to move away from the sanctions, because like I said, nobody wants to be the guy that lifted the sanctions to then have this guy revert back to being an authoritarian thug. So that's, I think, why it's still taking some time, even though the Assad regime is gone. They want to make sure who they're backing and who they're giving this money to. But to your original point, though, it is absolutely needed for Syria, because this country has been utterly destroyed after 14 years or 13 years of civil war and fighting, and they need funding maybe more than anything else. All right, moving to our last discussion point today before we get into Ukraine. The G20 finance ministers meeting took place in Cape Town, South Africa last week, in the last week of February, with the focus on helping low-income countries finance the shift to renewable energies. However, obviously, the headlines around this G20 summit have been focused on the lack of participation from wealthy countries. The U.S. Treasury Secretary didn't attend, and neither did finance ministers from China, Japan, India, or the EU. This, of course, comes amidst and after the gutting of USAID, and as the United Kingdom slashed their foreign aid budget 40% in order to spend more on defense. So, Tristen, one of the things you do is follow the G7, the G20 fairly closely, relatively speaking. So, what is your take on what happened last week and on the G20 meeting?
Well, the lack of participation by finance ministers in the meeting, I think, is something that we should be really concerned about, because it sends a signal about how, not just at the ministerial level, but how governments, how G20 governments view this global governance institution. And frankly, if they're not showing up to the meetings, it says quite clearly we don't view this as being important as an institution. We don't think that this is worth our time. And so, it's a meeting at the ministerial level, but it is one of the most important functions of the G20 to bring the finance ministers together. And if the US Treasury Secretary isn't there, China's not represented, Japan isn't represented, India's not representative, this is a problem. And what we may be seeing now is the beginnings of the atrophying of this organization. These informal governance groups can do a lot of good, but they can only do a lot of good if those around the table show up and are meaningfully, substantively invested in participating in the governing that they're meant to do. But if they're not even around the table, then not much happens.
Do you think this is a direct correlation to the Trump administration and their sort of stance on just international organizations, things like the G7 and the G20 in general? And this is sort of our first view of what the new world is going to look like?
Well, it's certainly part of the equation, but I don't want to lay everything
Right.
at the new American administration's
Yeah,
feet.
because the
So
China and India and the EU still had to make the decision not to come as well.
exactly, and so I think that absolutely the taking of the Oval Office by President Trump for his second term and his outright hostility to multilateralism is a big part of this, but it's certainly given then the license, say, to China, to Japan, to India, to say, yeah, we're not really seeing the value in this thing, and so we're not going to bother either. And as soon as the big main actors stop participating, it's really, really hard for the others in the group with less economic heft, with less economic power, to keep it going on their own. And simply put, it doesn't make sense to be you know to characterize yourself as being the top table of global economic governance if the likes of the United States and China are not at the table.
So what does this mean, on the ground? I mean, I know it's one meeting, but like, what are the negative outcomes of this because they weren't there? What are the things that, we talked about sort of the shift to green energy and renewable energy and stuff. Are we going to see a negative outcome as far as that goes just because they didn't come to one meeting, or is this something that like, yeah, maybe we can get it next time?
Well, I don't want to jump to conclusions and say just because key finance ministers didn't show up this time, it's all over. That's
Right.
absolutely not what I'm saying. But it's an indication of where we
Right.
might be heading, and this
Yeah.
is why we got to keep watching it. But I mean, on the ground, what it really means is that if I'm the South African Sherpa, so the individual who is responsible for the G20, for leading it during South Africa's presidency year, holding the chair of the G20, my job has suddenly gotten a lot harder because I'm not just trying to uh, drive an ambitious policy forward as the host of the G20. I'm just trying to get people to show up to the
Right.
party,
Right.
and then
Yeah.
beyond that, and the topics that South Africa has chosen to be at the very center of their agenda during their G20 presidency are the very ones that the United States has said we're not game for anymore. Global climate financing is at the very center of the South African agenda, as is aid to countries in the global south to help them with the climate transition, as is signaled by the brutal gutting of USAID, is also just not on the agenda anymore, at least not for the Americans. So this has suddenly become a really, really tricky thing for the South Africans to have to manage. And I do think that it's not just that the South Africans that are going to have this problem this year. I think this is a sign of things to come.
Yeah, and poor South Africa also, as you mentioned, was sort of behind the eight ball to begin with because it was, talking about aid, climate, and then they also had the tiff with Elon Musk over the land laws in South Africa, and Musk weighing in on that and everything as well. So, yeah. So another thing we'll keep our eye on as we look for future G7 and G20 meetings, and how that goes and who's involved. And hey, maybe it'll be the G8 again next time. Maybe we'll be inviting Russia back. Um, all right. Speaking of which, before we dive into our interview with Edward Fishman, just real quick, we can't do this podcast, and release it a week after the Zelensky Trump meeting without getting your thoughts on just that thing that happened last Friday.
Look, it was extraordinary.
Yes.
You and I both know that disagreements, heated exchanges happen all the time, but they happen behind closed doors and not in front of the assembled media. This was unbelievable. And you know, you could spend your weekend in a very unhealthy way, like I did, reading every analysis, every take you possibly could. Was this a setup? Was this an ambush? What was the intention here? Did Zelensky walk into a trap? We could talk about that endlessly, but the point is, one thing that we
Or should Zelensky have known what he was walking into and just not said anything? Because I've read that analysis as well. So, yeah,
Absolutely. I've probably watched the exchange again more than is healthy to have done so, and I think one of the things that particularly surprised me was that he did something that neither President Macron nor Prime Minister Starmer did earlier in the week. Both of them did not take the bait
right.
when there was a point of serious divergence amongst them. Which is not to say that they ignored it. Macron did an especially good job, I think, of stating that he does not see things the way that Trump and Vance do. But Zelensky lent into the argument, which then gave Vance license to completely open up on him. And then what at least I observed was that at first Trump did not jump in, but he didn't shut it down, he didn't stop it, but then eventually did join in the melee. And so from that I see I don't think that Trump intended for this to happen, but notably Trump chose not to shut it down. And what we are seeing from the Trump administration and Friday's debacle, Friday's disaster is indicative of is that um, the former reality TV game show host is choosing right now to govern by press conference. And this is somebody who is very, very good, unbelievably adept at being in front of the cameras, and unbelievably adept at being successful in a style of politics that is based on conflict. And what we saw on Friday was these two particular strengths of his in full display, and it may well have altered, and I don't want to be too hyperbolic, but it's hard not to be given the stakes, might have altered the history of the war.
And the world order. Yeah, I've read the analysis pieces out there over the weekend as well, and there's these some of them saying that Trump's playing some sort of like 4D chess game with like bad mouthing the Ukrainians so that he can then go back and put more pressure on the Russians and do this and do that and everything. I don't buy that line. I, unlike you, haven't rewatched the event. I've only seen snippets of it. I've read the transcript. I physically cannot watch it. As a U.S. diplomatic historian, that I just can't think of anything else like this out there. And I also, to your point too, like people disagree, but like the nature of it in front of the media, in front, a guy who's lost hundreds of thousands of people, fighting a war for their survival, coupled with like this parroting at times by the Trump administration in the last week or so of Russian talking points of like
Yeah,
Zelensky started the war, Zelensky's a dictator, like going back down this NATO expansion rabbit hole of that's why Russia attacked, and all of this stuff that doesn't make sense, and it's a push as I see it to try to normalize relations with Russia as soon as possible, to just so that we can move beyond the Ukraine war, so that he can so that the Trump administration can say they did end the war regardless of what the terms were. They can say they ended the war and they can then move forward. This transactional aspect to everything, that may be great that you ended a war, but is it giving you long-term stability? And that's the question that I keep coming back to. And I have glaring red warning signs that no. And to exactly to Zelensky's point in the meeting, we've negotiated with Putin, we've signed deals with Putin. When in the last 25 years has Putin said something or signed something and then not gone back on it? And that is my, like, what has he shown you that shows you you can trust this guy, and that this is all he wants? So, anyways, all right, Tristan, I will see you in 2 weeks, and
You bet.
we'll see what's happening in the world then. And that ends our news roundup. We're now going to move to our conversation on Ukraine with Edward Fishman. Edward is the author of the new book, Chokepoints: American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, that focuses on the evolution of sanctions as a tool of U.S. foreign policy. He served in the Treasury, Defense, and State Departments from 2011 to 2017, including in the Office of Economic Sanctions Policy and Implementation and on Secretary of State John Kerry's policy planning staff. Let's listen in to the conversation. All right, welcome back, folks. I promised you our mini deep dive this week would talk about Ukraine and Russia and what's going on. And I'm grateful to be joined today by Edward Fishman, who actually just wrote a book on sanctions and things that are tightly tied to what's going on in Ukraine right now. But his new book is called Chokepoints: American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. And Edward's going to talk to us about the book a little bit today, but also give us his thoughts on the Ukraine issue. Edward, thanks for joining us.
Kelly, thanks so much for having me on.
All right, so I want to start off by taking a little bit of a step back. So obviously the news in the last few days has been pretty huge, but your book, I want to talk about your book as it relates to the background of Russia's war in Ukraine. You call the period in your book of 2006 to the present the age of economic warfare. What do you mean by this, and why do you start in 2006?
Sure. So, the age of economic warfare is a world in which sanctions, tariffs, export controls, and other economic weapons have become the primary way that great powers compete with one another. The reason I term it an age is because I do think it represents a real sea change from where we were in the 90s, for instance, where hyperglobalization led to a world economic order in which relations between countries, even the US and China or the US and Russia, were seen as win-win. The more trade, the more financial ties we had, were always seen as beneficial both to us and other countries. What we have now, and what really started manifesting in 2006, when Stuart Levy, who was the first Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, started building a new form of financial isolation against Iran, was we started to realize that these same elements of hyperglobalization that we had thought had made the world a safer and more prosperous place could also be weaponized against other countries. These are the choke points that give my book its title. So it could be economic networks like the dollar-based financial network or semiconductor supply chains, oil supply chains. Most of these choke points are under U.S. control, and so the U.S. government has become very effective at weaponizing them in the past several decades. But there are other choke points that other countries dominate, like critical minerals is one that the Chinese government has more power over than we do. And so the reason I term it an age of economic warfare as opposed to an era of American economic warfare is what's really happened since 2006 is it's not just the United States who's really leaned into this type of competition, but really every single other major power in the world.
Yeah, and I that's an interesting specific point to do that in your title, and I want to talk to you a little bit more later about the critical minerals aspect and the fact that other countries can now do this as well. It's not just an American thing. But moving more directly to Russia and Ukraine, in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and was fighting its war in the Donbas the first time around, sanctions against Russia really kind of rose to the top as far as a U.S. response to the war. And then the Europeans were a little late to the party, but after the downing of the Malaysia Air flight in 2014, sort of jumped on as well. In your estimation, can you take us sort of through that response and what it looked like, and how effective was it in
Yeah.
your estimation?
So, look, the 2014 sanctions against Russia were a major turning point in the whole story that I tell in Chokepoints, because up until then, the US had really been pioneering this new kind of economic warfare against Iran. And Iran was it's not a small fry in the global economy, but it's also not, a major player. With Russia, when it annexed Crimea in 2014, this was a G8 economy, a G20 economy. It was the eighth largest economy in the world's largest producer of fossil fuels. And actually, at the time, Kelly, in 2014, Russia's economy was bigger than all other economies under US sanctions combined. So this really marked the
Wow.
first time that the US was trying to use this new arsenal against another significant economic power. The other thing that was novel is if you go back even to the sanctions against Iran that led up to the nuclear deal, it was a slow burning crisis, right? It was something that played out over several years in which Iran was gradually building up its nuclear enrichment capabilities and the other components it would need ultimately to have a weapons program. With Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, and I know you were in government at the time as well, it really took us by surprise. It was the type of thing where you show up at work and you're watching CNN with everybody else in the United States as the little green men descend
Right.
on government buildings in Sevastopol. And so it's a fundamentally different problem you're dealing with, where you have a rapidly moving crisis in which the status quo is swiftly getting worse, and you need to do something quickly to rectify it. Of course, the problem is that, again, Russia's a very large economy. If you're going to impose significant sanctions on Russia, chances are it could spill over, certainly into the European economy, which is right next door. And Europe is still sort of really wallowing in the Eurozone crisis at the time in 2014. And then, of course, there's the risk of even, spilling over into the US economy through kind of the same financial contagion pathways that led to the 2008 financial crisis. So there's real concern about what sanctions could do, not just to hurt, not just to hurt Russia, but to hurt ourselves. And so there's sort of this paradox where we need to act quickly, but we also need to be really considerate about what we're doing. So, what ultimately the Obama administration and the Europeans land on is the sanctions early on in March of 2014 were relatively symbolic. They focused on Kremlin officials, people who are close to Putin, but they didn't actually go as far as like economic sanctions on major Russian companies. It wasn't until the summer of 2014 that the US and the Europeans did some significant sectoral sanctions against the Russian energy, defense, and banking sector. And the sanctions were explicitly designed to be scalpel like, was the term that was used at the
Yeah.
time, because there wasn't a desire to push Russia into a dramatic economic crisis. It was really almost a signaling exercise to show the Russians that we were serious and to try to deter Russia from pushing further into Ukraine, because at the time there was also little green men in the Donbass. So, you
Mhm.
sort of saw the beginnings of the broader war that would happen in 2022. But, just like warfare, just like military warfare, economic warfare, doesn't always survive the first meeting with the enemy exactly as you expect it to. And in the second half of 2014, oil prices completely collapsed. And this is the largest sector of Russia's economy. And so the combined impact of those sanctions that were put in place in the summer of 2014 and the precipitous decline in oil prices in the second half of 2014 leads to Russia's economy completely moving into a tailspin. And actually, in the winter of 2014, 2015, Russia's economy is declining at an annualized rate of about 10%. So a really colossal
Yeah.
economic contraction. And at the time, I think this is kind of the roots of the current conflict we have, because at the time, instead of pressing our advantage, Western leaders, and in particularly European leaders, were actually afraid of the damage that was being done to Russia's economy. They said, we didn't want to do this. And I think actually Francois Hollande, the French president, says at the time, we don't want to push Russia to its knees. And so it's at that point in February of 2014 when we get the Minsk II agreement,
Right.
where Putin, Poroshenko, who is the Ukrainian president, Hollande, the French president, and Merkel, spend almost 24 hours straight negotiating in a room in Minsk to try to get a ceasefire. And the reason I think that's such an important turning point is, we had Russia in a really tough spot. I think we could have continued to increase the pressure, but we wound up settling for honestly a not particularly well constructed ceasefire that Russia
Yeah.
routinely violated. We didn't do anything to penalize Russia. And then basically 6 years goes by, the last year and a half of Obama's presidency and all 4 years of Trump's presidency, with no meaningful escalation of pressure on Russia. And so I think by the time we get to 2021, when you have 100,000 Russian troops circling Ukraine's border, and Biden's trying to use the threat of devastating economic harm to deter Putin from invading, by then Putin has sort of sized up economic warfare and thought, you know what, the West may have the capability to really hurt my economy, but they don't have the will. And I think that winds up being a tragic psychological lesson for Putin, and one that leads to the calamity that's been the war in the last several years.
So that's a good segue to 2021 and 2022. How did the sanctions regime and partnerships look different in 2022 once the invasion happened? And you mentioned in 2014 the rapid pace of things. Did the months in late 2021 when we in the US became pretty convinced that Putin was going to invade, did that allow us more time to sort of come up with this more serious sanctions regime in a more thoughtful, strategic way? So yeah, so how did this come about, and what are the successes or failures of it as you see it?
Yeah. So the intelligence success of basically getting Putin dead to rights, right? Nailing
Yeah,
it in the fall of 2021. Not only that Putin intended to invade Ukraine, but it sounds like almost getting his entire war plans and intentions. I mean, that's something that almost never happens in the world of intelligence,
yeah,
as you know, even better than I do. And so as a result, it almost gives us the best possible circumstance to test whether economic warfare could be used as a deterrent, whether you could use the threat of what Biden called the most severe sanctions that have ever been imposed to change Putin's mind about the wisdom of invading Ukraine in the first place. This was done both as a rhetorical strategy, one where President Biden and other European leaders made repeated public statements through December of 2021, January and February 2022, making very clear to Putin that he would face economic harm if he invaded Ukraine. And then underneath the hood, you had American officials and other officials in the G7 actually putting together menus of sanctions options. And that's a big part of the narrative of my book, is explaining how people like Dalip Singh, who is the Deputy National
mm,
Security Advisor for International Economics in the Biden administration, was really kind of quarterbacking this effort to come up with sanctions options. I think, though, that the context was difficult for this type of a campaign, because we had inflation at a 4-decade high and oil prices that were getting really high as well. And so as a result, in some ways, we sort of tied our hands behind our back, because the charge that was given to Dalip and other sanctions planners was, let's maximize pressure on Russia without going after its oil sales. Um, and so by the time we get to late February, the threat of deterrence fails, right? Putin invades. And by then, it's very clear that either he doubted the credibility, or more likely the will of the West to impose sanctions on him. And kind of stunningly, the West gets its act together really quickly and imposes even stronger sanctions than
yeah.
they had expected, including on the Central Bank of Russia, which was something that even Russian officials said they were not prepared for. And in some ways, that was a good thing, in that that's why we have $300 billion of Russian assets frozen, because the Russians had their money sitting in euros and yen and pounds and dollars. But on the other hand, it suggests that this whole messaging strategy that was the crux of deterrence didn't work, that Putin basically underestimated the severity of the sanctions he would face. And so by the time Putin invades, the goal of the sanctions shifts. It's no longer deterrence, that's no longer possible. And it becomes something a little bit more modest, which is attrition, basically to weaken Russia's economy and weaken Russia's military industrial complex, so that he has less of an ability to do harm in Ukraine. And basically, it's sort of the flip side of military assistance to Ukraine. On the one hand, military assistance to Ukraine is trying to strengthen Ukraine's ability to fight a war, and the sanctions on Russia are trying to weaken Putin's ability to fight the war. And I think in that respect, the sanctions worked relatively well. Where you are now is 3 years into the conflict, Russia's economy is in terrible shape. You got the benchmark interest rate at 21%. You can't get a home mortgage in Russia for anything less than 30%. Basically, the entire economy is funneled toward the war effort, and there's nothing
Yeah.
else productive going on. And even the Central Bank of Russia is projecting zero growth this year. And for those of us who follow Russian official statements, that zero growth probably translates into something like -2 or
Right.
-3%
Yeah.
growth. Um, so look, I think a big reason that Putin is so desperately seeking a bilateral deal with Trump right now is I don't think he can continue as things are going for another year or two, just with the way his economy is looking. That doesn't mean sanctions have been a crowning success, right? I mean, it's 3 years of war in which
Right.
Ukraine has been ravaged. But just like military statecraft, economic statecraft doesn't work overnight. And I think being able to push the Russian economy to the point it is now in 3 years is not such a bad outcome.
Yeah, and you talked about Putin's desire for a bilateral agreement with the U.S. to try to end things in Ukraine and offer relief. So I'd love to get your thoughts, in general on what's taken place in like the last week with U.S. Russia, U.S. Ukraine relations, but also as of this morning, this is Tuesday morning, March 4th, that we're recording this. The U.S. has frozen military aid to Russia, and President Trump has directed the Treasury and State Departments to draw up a list of sanctions that could be removed, with Russia pushing publicly for even more concessions. If the U.S. does remove sanctions, do you have a sense of like what types of things that would be, how valuable it would be for Russia? In your mind, do we have a? It sounds like we have a pretty big card to play on removing these sanctions. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I'd love to get into the nitty gritty of the sanctions, but maybe just first, what is Putin trying to achieve? He's basically trying to make the case to Trump and Trump's inner circle, like Steve Witkoff, that sanctions on Russia are not useful in terms of the war in Ukraine. And in fact, they're a hindrance to US business. He's
Hmm.
basically trying to persuade Trump and his advisors that the US should lift sanctions on Russia because it's good for the United States, basically setting aside the Ukraine issue entirely. This is something that Putin has done in the past. It's again a big narrative that I tell in Chokepoints is, in 2015, a big effort that Putin had to try to get sanctions lifted wasn't by implementing this Minsk ceasefire agreement that I mentioned earlier. It was by offering, nuclear power cooperation to Hungary, or offering financial assistance to Alexis Tsipras, who was the leader of Greece at the time,
Yeah.
basically trying to pick off individual countries with the offers of economic assistance and saying, you have more to gain from cooperating with us economically than you do through sanctions on us. I think this argument is a total sham, frankly. I think there's not very many significant business opportunities for the United States in Russia. I think even if you were to have all the sanctions lifted tomorrow, if anything, I think it might be bad for the U.S. economy, and I'm happy to get into why. But it seems like it's getting some traction with the Trump team. The fact that he's tasked, allegedly by reports, I think in Reuters, tasked the state and Treasury departments to draw up lists of potential sanctions to remove. I mean, these are the same officials who could otherwise be spending their time at work creating new sanctions against Iran or Russia or China. So, I mean, that is a significant allocation of just the time and resources of the US government into this, which suggests that they're taking it quite seriously. So, what sanctions could be removed? The U.S. has pretty significant sanctions on most of the key sectors of Russia's economy, fairly comprehensive sanctions on the banking sector and the defense sector. On the energy sector, as I mentioned earlier, the sanctions have been more modest, but ratcheted up quite a bit in the final weeks of Biden's presidency. Actually, on January 10th, so 10 days before he left the White House, he imposed sanctions on a handful of the biggest oil companies in Russia. I think what Putin wants the most is a relaxation of the oil and financial sanctions, which would allow him to start accumulating more hard currency like the dollar that he could use to stabilize economy, buy imports. Do I think that he will get this? I'm a little skeptical for a couple of reasons. One, the way that Biden crafted these sanctions is that they were done under a 2017 law called the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CATSA. And what that means is if Trump actually moves to lift them, it will trigger an automatic 30-day congressional review period in which Congress will have the chance to vote down any relaxation of sanctions. Will Congress vote down a relaxation of sanctions? It would take a veto-proof majority, so you'd need quite a bit of Republicans to go with it.
Yeah.
However, what I'll say is that lifting sanctions on Russian oil and gas will be catastrophic for the American shale industry. It would be very bad for oil states like Louisiana, Oklahoma, Texas, Pennsylvania. I think this is a big reason you've seen senators like Ted Cruz have so much opposition to things like Nord Stream 2. It's why you see the Louisiana delegation making very hawkish comments about Russia right now. And so I do think Trump would have a fight on his hands, and I think it would run directly counter to his goal of American energy dominance. So I'm a little skeptical that we'll get there, but never say never. We just saw 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico,
Right.
despite pretty broad domestic opposition from both business and labor.
Yeah, and I'm glad you linked the sanctions issue not just to the war in Ukraine and the war economy and all that stuff, but like back to what it could mean domestically for the U.S. and how that calculates into Trump's political calculations. And we'll see how that goes. But I've read a lot over the last year or two about the Russians' capabilities to sidestep sanctions through, like, especially in the oil and gas sector, through like ghost fleets and everything. So how effective has that been? I mean, you're saying that they still would really like to get these sanctions released. So it's obviously it hasn't been that successful.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the Russians, what they've done is they haven't necessarily created a magic formula to evade sanctions. I think this is actually one of the media narratives around the Russia sanctions that's most misleading. What they've really done is they've just taken advantages of loopholes of the sanctions that the U.S. purposefully put in. So again, for oil, for instance, right? The price cap on Russian oil, which states that Western service providers, so insurance companies or tanker companies based in Greece or anywhere in the G7, can't provide service to shipments of Russian oil for anything below $60 a barrel. The US government explicitly said that, well, if Russia ships the oil on its own ships with its own insurance and it doesn't have any G7 services attached to it, that's okay. That was an explicit statement by members of the Biden administration, because they did not want to disrupt the flow of oil to global markets. They were so worried about a supply crunch leading to higher oil prices and worsening inflation. And so what Russia has done is they've just taken advantage of the loopholes in the sanctions. I think were Trump to actually want a just peace in Ukraine and to get significant leverage over Putin, he could close these loopholes pretty easily. And I don't think Russia would find it particularly easy to evade them.
Oh, that's interesting. And again, though, that comes with, as you mentioned, large political fallout here in the U.S. If then you've got rising gas prices and oil prices that continue to increase inflation. So, okay, moving to the Europeans. We talked about the Europeans joining in 2014 and working with the US and everything in 2022. Where are they on all of this? Do they have any leverage outside of the US being involved if the US does sort of turn these things off? And I know they're talking about taking the seized funds and using it for the Ukrainians and things like that. So is that all just wishful thinking, or do they hold any cards in this?
I'm really glad you brought this up, because this is another reason why I don't think there are really meaningful business opportunities for US multinationals in Russia. Because let's say Trump were actually to successfully lift all US sanctions, and he didn't care about, what it would do to the American shale industry, and he didn't care about this potential fight in Congress, but he just lifted all the sanctions, right? European sanctions, if anything, will get stronger. They'll certainly stay in place. British sanctions would stay in place. And, for American banks, I mean, all the major American banks have operations in London, in Frankfurt, in Paris. They're not going to want to have a patchwork compliance regime in which they have to worry about violating European law just for the sake of, reestablishing ties with Sberbank or VTB or any of these Russian banks. So I do think the European sanctions will be an impediment to business resuming between US companies and Russian companies. In terms of what the Europeans could do, I'm really glad you brought up the Russian reserves. So I mentioned earlier that the most significant sanction that was imposed in 2022 were the sanctions on the central bank of Russia, the one big sanction that Putin was not expecting. The thing that was interesting is that in 2018, the central bank of Russia actually diversified its reserves out of the dollar and into the euro. Most central banks hold about 60% of their reserves in dollars, and that was the same for Russia, really leading up to 2018. But around 2018, and this is when Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, imposed export controls on ZTE, imposed sanctions on Rusal, the Russian aluminum company. Basically, the Russians looking at Trump and saying he's pretty erratic when it comes to the use of these sanctions. They took their dollars, over 100 billion worth of dollars, and moved them into euros. A little bit into RMB and gold, but they really moved them into euros because Putin's calculus and Nabulina, the central bank's governor's calculus, was if the United States one day goes on the economic offensive against us, the Europeans are no way that they're joining in, right? So they felt secure, basically, that there was lower political risk being in the euro. And what that means is there's about 250 billion euros worth of Russian government assets just sitting in European bank accounts. I do think it is a win-win for the US, Europe, and actually a win-win-win because the US, Europe, and Ukraine for the Europeans to seize these assets and repurpose them for Ukraine. Just to give a sense of the scale, I mean, since the beginning of the war, so for 3 years, the U.S. has given somewhere between $100 and $150 billion worth of assistance to Ukraine. We're talking about 250 billion euros that could be given to the Ukrainians tomorrow if the Europeans want to, right?
Yeah.
And the reason I think this is such a win is obviously puts Ukraine on stronger financial and military footing. It accords with Trump's goal to have the Europeans share more of the burden and basically step up and foot the bill for the Ukrainians without burdening the U.S. taxpayer at all. And I think it will help revive the U.S. defense industrial base because what is this money going to be used for? It's going to be used to buy weapons. And still, the best weapons are made by American companies. So practically speaking, this would be a giant stimulus package for the American defense industrial base to support Ukraine. I think the impact on the idea of peace is, again, putting yourself in Putin's shoes. He knows his economy at best has a year or two before it really goes into free fall. And if all of a sudden he says, oh my God, the Ukrainians now have $250 billion worth of military assistance that they can tap whenever they want, I think it makes Putin much more liable to actually try to negotiate a just peace.
Yeah, well, we'll see what is to come out of the talks that have been going on in Europe over the past couple of days about trying to put forth their own peace plan, and whether or not they include these euros and any sort of thing to use as some leverage over the Russians or not. But any thoughts on kind of what to watch moving forward, or I mean, who knows? I mean, that's a pretty big one.
Yeah, look, I think the action right now is in Europe, right? We have to see, are the Europeans actually going to step up? I think we have a good sense of where Trump stands on these issues. It sounds like he doesn't particularly care so much about what happens to Ukraine. Thanks, Kelly. I appreciate it. It's good to be here today. Willing to continue U.S. military assistance if he thinks it's in America's interest, maybe if we get a critical minerals deal with Ukrainians. I think it's really in the Europeans' court to make the case that they're willing to step up. We've seen the British and French say that they're willing to put boots in the ground, which I think is a tremendous development to potentially, give Ukraine a de facto security guarantee from the Europeans. But I think this sovereign assets question is a big one because this is a strong argument the Europeans have to say that they're going to be footing the bill for the Ukrainians. The American taxpayer is not going to be burdened at all. And I think there's a strong case to sort of Trump's deal-making businessman instincts that this is a giant stimulus for the defense companies in the U.S. that need the money. They need those orders to really get their factories humming, which is a big priority for the Trump administration.
Yeah, and he can do it without those dollars coming from the U.S. To Ukraine, and it's the Europeans that are doing it this time. So, yeah. All right, Eddie, thank you so much for joining us. And be sure to check out his new book, Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. Thanks again to Edward Fishman for his time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. And thanks to Tristen Naylor for joining us as our new co-host on Headlines in History. And we'll see him again in 2 weeks. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.